Yeah, no, no, yeah. One for everywhere for her. I asked the day to be off as well. It's gonna get it.
This counts as spousal support.
No, I mean, yeah, I got a huge relationship with my mom. I was just felt like I just haven't even mind to okay, we recognize it. So go ahead.
I'm gonna be out, so let me be out.
If you sit through it, but I was like, you know what? Go ahead. So let's get all the and
Hello.
I'm like,
Good evening, everybody. You look wonderful from here. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Alicia. I'm the director of the Individual Art Center, a multidisciplinary art space where we celebrate art and food all year long. We just opened our 50th season on Saturday, and this is the first event of this anniversary. I'm very, very, very honored to receive Alicia here tonight, and Mayukh, we just met a few minutes ago. We met a year ago, exactly, it's our anniversary today. A year ago, I curated a whole exhibition and festival, 5 weeks exhibition and festival, celebrating the union between arts and food, and that's when Alicia came to visit the exhibition, and a week after she wrote probably the best piece for this exhibition on her newsletter, Substack newsletter. If you're not, I encourage you to subscribe to this newsletter. Weekly one, yes, it's the best weekly I have recently, and I told her, please come back anytime, and here she is tonight. So I'm not very long. I need to give the microphone to Jenny from Magic that I would like to thank. Magic is our partner here in the book. We have a lot of events here, and it's always wonderful. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here, and Jenny, it's you.
It's going to be over to your left, just by those doors. And we'll also be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so start thinking of the questions to ask now. Running up down the aisle to hand you this mic. And after the talk, Alicia will be signing personalized books right where you signed them earlier. If you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of No Meat Required online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, I'm excited to introduce Alicia Kennedy and Mayukh, who are here to join us tonight to launch Alicia's debut book, No Meat Required. No Meat Required is a culinary and cultural history of plant-based eating in the United States that delves into the subcultures and politics that have defined alternative food. Kennedy, a vegetarian, former vegan, and once proprietor of a vegan bakery, understands how to present this history with sympathy, knowledge, and humor. No Meat Required brings much needed understanding of vegan and vegetarian cuisine and makes it passionate about its radical heart. Alicia Kennedy's work on food and culture has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Eater, and elsewhere. She publishes essays, cultural criticism, recipes, and more in her weekly newsletter, From the Desk of Alicia Kennedy. No Meat Required is her first book. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Mayukh is here in discussion with Alicia. Mayukh is the author of Tastemakers, which is also available for purchase up at the front. His food writing has been anthologized in 3 editions of the Best American Food Writing, and his biography of actress Myrtle Oberon is forthcoming. So without further delay, everyone please give a very warm welcome to Alicia and Mayukh.
Your debut book is already a bestseller. It's going to its 2nd printing within, what, 2 weeks or something like that? A month, and so congratulations. I want to dive right into it. And I I want to start off by asking you a variation of a question that we'll be laughing at. I want to start off by asking a variation of a question that you used to ask your podcast guests, like myself. Where did you grow up, and what did you grow up eating?
This is a terrible question to ask in front of my mother. I can't answer so honestly. I grew up on Long Island in a town called Patchogue on the South Shore, and I grew up eating everything, and I think that's really kind of, the book is grounded in the fact that I grew up eating everything and really loved meat, and what it meant to kind of release that from my life, and so, yeah, everything. Chicken cutlets. They try still to feed me the chicken cutlets.
Well, I want to know, what was your moment of a spiritual awakening when you decided that you were going to go plant-based?
It was a really gradual transition for me where, and the funny thing is it was spiritual, but it was just a really absurd, moment where I was doing a meditation and I came out and I was like, I have to stop. And I knew I was going to stop, but it was a transition that was like that when I really made the decision. I really said, you know what, I'm done. But it was something I came to gradually because I, spent a long time introducing into my life, looking at if for a week I don't eat meat, what does that look like? For a day I don't eat meat, what does that look like? And then I realized I felt a lot better, and I felt a lot more aligned with my own, ethics and thoughts about what food should be or what being alive should be. And so I gradually came to the point where I adapted it. And it was my 26th birthday, and actually someone is here who was there, where I had all my friends come over and I just announced, I'm vegan now. And then I served them a gluten-free vegan cake that was probably disgusting. But it was just a really sudden transition, and I think since then it's still been, it still felt, I think, to a lot of people in my life like a random transition. Yeah.
Well, I'm assuming that's not the case anymore.
No.
Yeah.
The cakes are better.
Yeah. So, how did you find your way into the wonderful world of food writing, which is how we met?
So they didn't introduce Mayukh as a James Beard Award-winning food writer, but that is what Mayukh is, and so. But I don't know. I never thought I'd be a food writer, but I, had always wanted to be a writer, and I'm going to be meta right now and say it's very uncomfortable for me to be the person interviewed. I am so used to doing interviewing, and I am really uncomfortable. But we're gonna get through this together. But I always wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to write, and it took different forms for me. I wanted to write about music, and then I wanted to write about books, and then I started to cook when I gave up meat because I simply had to. And then I don't know, it just ended up that I was like, oh, I have this whole world that people aren't paying attention to in food writing. Because a lot of people are before or whatever. It's I was working in New York Magazine, I was a copy editor. We worked 50 hours a week. When it was Fashion Week, I'm so triggered by Fashion Week because we would work 60, 70 hours a week, and I'm even just seeing New York Fashion Week on the internet just brings back. And so, it was a very, very stressful job, and I was always on my computer. And so I started to make as a way of doing things with my hands. And I realized that I really enjoy this, and maybe I can write about all these people that I think are really cool. They all ended up in the book, basically. Obviously, Alicia, what comes to mind is the most important person in terms of changing my thinking about food, helping me to think about being a baker, helping me to think about what it meant to take animal products out of my life. And so I just thought, oh, these are stories that aren't being told, and they're not being told why. And then you realize it's because people have so many misconceptions, even today. I think this week I was still really Pietramala is a best new restaurant from Bon Appetit, and still the first lines are it's vegan, but if it's good, do we have to call it vegan? And so, this is still a common thing, and it's I wanted to write about this food as though it was just food, as though it was anything else. And I saw that opening, but I also, came up against a lot of people who just thought it was silly and frivolous and et cetera, and those people still exist. But I think more and more there are food writers especially who are coming out who are saying that they're not eating meat, or saying that they're I think that now it's like, actually we're coming to a place where food writing isn't something that is something you can totally divorce from ethics or politics or a sense of social justice, and I hope that that continues. But it is very, very slow going, because the idea of the food writer in culture is someone who is just eating everything. It's just excess. It's the Anthony Bourdain, or it's the other folks who just eat everything and go everywhere and find it really appalling to have any sort of restriction for any reason. And so I think thinking of veganism or giving up meat is not restriction, is something that's happening more and more.
Slowly.
Slowly.
So at what point did you have the idea for this book?
It's a funny question to ask, because I think that I just started this book and the research for it when I went vegan, because I was like, oh, I have to be vegan, or to say I'm vegetarian or whatever, I have to understand years and years of history, so I can justify this to everybody, and explain it to everybody, and also to understand the cooking aspect of it, to be like, okay, how have people been doing this? What does it look like for years, and how can I kind of contribute to this lineage? And so I just started doing that research and trying to really understand it. And my literary agent Jenny is here, who has worked on the proposal with me. And I think that, it's just the thing I wrote about, so it's the thing I had to write a book about. And it's not that I didn't want to write the book about it. It's just that it's in publishing you only have so many options in terms of what people want from you, and it's well, you're the vegan food writer, right? You're the one who writes about vegan things, so the vegan book is the thing you can do. And so, but it's, at the same time, I think it ended up in the right place, and it ended up in the right hands to make sense of itself in the landscape. But I think I've been doing this research for over a decade, which is also why I think some parts of the book where it's just duh. But it's because I've been thinking about it for so long. Yeah.
I'm curious, so was it a top sale of publishers back in 2020, which is when I believe you sold it?
Yeah, no, and it was because I was working on the proposal for a long time, and it went out a couple of times to finally end up with vegan, which I think is where it belongs. But a lot of people, didn't think, the same as with food writing, they didn't think vegan food was something that sold. They didn't think people were interested in it. It didn't matter that plant-based cuisine is on the rise, or that there's all this interest in, all these plant-based restaurants are coming out. I think now is a much friendlier time than when I was selling the book. If 11 Madison Park had gone plant-based when I was trying to sell the book, it might have been a different story, but it also might have been a story I didn't want to tell, where I had to talk a lot about, Daniel Hum and sunflower seed butter. It's things that I don't care about in private rooms where they still serve meat or whatever it is. So it's I sold it at a good time where it was okay, we're culturally in a place where we can have this conversation, but we're not in a place where it's not fun anymore. It was still kind of Wild West, I guess, and I think it still is.
Totally. Yeah, it's been 3 years, and I feel the landscape has only slowly changed,
Yes.
like I said earlier. So I'm curious, anyone who's written a nonfiction book knows that the book that you sell on the proposal stage is not necessarily the book that hits the bookshelves. So how did the shape of your book change as you wrote it?
I think it got I think you can sense it, I guess, if you read the book, where it's there's a lot of desperation for people to be take this seriously, please. And I would change now, I think. But there, when we were in the pandemic when I was writing it, there was this knowledge that it had, zoonotic disease was something that we were going to be dealing with. That, animal welfare was part of the reason why we were doing this in the first place. And so when I was writing the book, it was very much a desperation, a real desperation for people to take it seriously. And then, but a lot of the book, I think there's still the fun of what I found, 10 years ago or 11 years ago when I started to research this sort of subcultures and politics is, it's it is really fun and it is really interesting. It is filled with really fun characters, but at the same time, it's also like we are in this desperate moment where it's like either people change, systems change, or goodbye. And so like it was very difficult to kind of swim that kind of current or walk that bridge, where it's like, this is very serious, I need you to take this seriously. This is something most people have never taken seriously. And also it's very, very important. So how do I convince you, but also not overwhelm you at the same time? It's really, really difficult thing to do. But I think it was more fun in the end than what I proposed. I think also when it was in the proposal stage, it was still very serious, but less like disease and climate change serious, and more like the corporations who are devising technique or trying to, make our food into IP serious. So like now it ended up like more of like kind of an amalgamation of every book I've ever written.
Yeah, one of the beauties of this book, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, is that it's really funny, and Alicia's obviously a very funny and charismatic person, and she has the ability to translate that onto the page, so you gotta pick it up if you haven't yet. But I wanted to know, so by the time you began working on this book, you'd also become the Substack celebrity. I would love to know, how was it balancing these kind of competing demands, or maybe complementary demands of writing a book against writing a weekly newsletter that also invites so much scrutiny?
You know what? Thank you for saying that. It was difficult in the moment. I feel like at this point I don't even remember how hard it was, but I know that it was hard because I complain to you all the time. It was at the end. It became very complimentary because it simply had to, and like a lot of things that I was writing for the newsletter ended up feeding into the book. Things like being presented with like a live fish ceviche and thinking I can eat it because this is an invasive fish, and it's like really, this is, my ethics are telling me eat the invasive species. And then when I was presented with it, I was like, oh, it's a dead fish, I don't want to eat it. And so like that, made it into the book. And I think that it's important because I think a lot of people think of vegans and vegetarians as just like very holier than thou, or very like moralistic, or just very like driven by the righteousness rather than like a sense of, just it's something a lot different than that, I think, most of the time. But there's a lot of omnivorous food writers who will be like, oh, well, it's vegetarian, so like they'll be happy with it because they don't like anything. They're happy when you give them brown rice and a piece of lentil. But like for me, it was like, no, this comes from something deeper, and it's a very difficult thing to grapple with, because sometimes you'll be presented with something that you think on an intellectual level that you should eat, and then you feel differently about it. And so bringing that into the book, when I was experiencing it in real time and getting to write about it in the newsletter, I think it gave me a place to kind of like play with ideas and see how they responded to people. And so things that people responded to well, I didn't want to bring into the book, because I was like, okay, like it wasn't really like a conscious testing ground or polling ground, but it was something where it was like, oh, okay, this is something that hits with people, where it's like, it is complicating people's notions of what it means to give up meat and give up seafood for the most part, and like, so okay, let's bring that somehow into the book, and so I tried to make it complimentary. At the same time, I've written so many essays in the newsletter, I've lost count. Most of them are probably terrible. Like, people will quote them on the internet, and then I'm like, I don't know, like, did I write that? Like, who wrote that? Because there's so many, and then I'm like, okay, like, there's pieces of all of these that, like, tell me something. There's, like, a glimmer of an idea here. And so it's really just a place of, like, working things out, which is, like, a really good thing, I think, to have as a writer, actually. Like, obviously, I have to keep churning out essays or I start moving money, but that's everybody. Everybody has to keep working, or most of us, we stop having money. And so, like, it's just a place I decided I'm going to work things out or not. I take it very seriously, but at the same time, I'm like, this is where I sound things out for the world.
Something else that kind of you carried over from the newsletter into the book is like very painful fiction, so food as an object. Alicia opens her book with this beautiful, just like image of her cooking banana blossoms, and I want to know, where did you learn how to write about food in such a sensual way?
I think for me, it's just about describing the experience. I've read a lot of food writing, obviously. I think all of us are, we've read especially like Nigella and Nigel Slater. I think that when it comes down to it, Nigella Lawson and Nigel Slater are like and I think Ruby Tandero has like called Nigel Slater like the uncle or whatever of food writers now. I think both of them have influenced so much how people write now, and especially me, because it's like, okay, like, when I look at this, what do I see? And I just describe it, and that's it. And I also think it's an impulse from reading fiction and being like, also, like, at the end of the day, I can be a very, curt writer. I could just be like, point, and but then I go back to things, and I'm like, okay, how do I actually make this beautiful and interesting? And then it's in the description. But like, for me as a person, I don't walk in, like sometimes I can see something beautiful about like lemons in the kitchen, obviously, but at the same time, I'm not like, oh, the lemons and the yellow and the sunlight and blah, blah, blah. But like, when I see them, I'm not thinking that. But when I'm writing, I can be like, okay, I know I need to make this more interesting, so how do I describe it? And like, it's that like, expressive moment of like, I have to describe what I see, I have to describe what I feel. That's what actually makes writing, and not just like, I'm talking. So it's, it's an amalgamation of so many things of just like looking, reading, and also like reading about my own work and being like, this isn't interesting. I need to make this more interesting for people.
You mentioned you read fiction too, so what kinds of non-food writing did you find yourself visiting as you read this book?
Well, this book, interestingly, I wasn't reading fiction really while I was writing it. I found it really difficult. I find it very difficult when I'm concentrating very hard to read fiction, and I wish that weren't the case. Like, fiction for me has to be like a very leisurely thing. But at the same time, like, I was writing about fiction. I was reading always Kate Zambrino. I love Kate Zambrino. But I was also reading Lauren Elkin's Clues about women walking in different cities. And I think that book was one of those that really opened up space. Also reading Georges Perec, reading, this is something that influences me in general, but like, I can't remember the name right now, but it's about him describing everything that happens in a plaza in Paris in one day. And I think because I also live now in like a very small town, basically, in North-Saint-Laurent, it really has taught me how to see changes in very small things. And that was something I like, when I read the Georges Perec, I was like, oh, okay, like this is like every day of my life. And I'm going to use what I learned from this to describe better. Like it goes back to the last question. It's like, how do I learn to describe things better? And it's from reading people who are writing about kind of simple things, but also writing about reading and the act of reading. And that really influenced, because especially the book is mostly referencing cookbooks, like the experience of like going through the cookbooks, or, I don't write about restaurants very much, or like being in restaurants, but, so it's very much a book about reading and interacting with texts. And so I took a lot from literary critics reading texts and then importing them to their own lives, which was kind of how I approached like bringing the cookbooks into it too.
And your book is so dense with research, but in a way that's very readable, You've done a wonderful job.
There are people who have been like, it's so dense. In a terrible way.
No. That's one of the virtues of the book. What was the most challenging part of, making sure that you were condensing all that research into something that was readable and had some sort of pulse sensation?
I think it all comes back to bringing the food into it, where it's like, I think I realized when I was writing where it's like, okay, if I get into the weeds too much, doing references or research or whatever, I have to come back to it with food, and what would that food be? Like, what's interesting is that there are things I didn't think I'd write about necessarily, like, I knew I'd write about tofu, of course, but I didn't know I'd write about, like, eating tofu at a But like when I started that chapter, I was like, oh, I have to bring this in because it's like this was a formative experience for me, but also it might be a recognizable formative experience for the reader. And I know from my own reading where I'm like, especially because I do love these books, where like it's a woman reading and doing a memoir at the same time. So I'm like, you know, if you're doing a lot of criticism and then you're keeping me away from like the good juicy story and too much, like I'm like, give me the good juicy story. So I want, not that like me eating tofu is a juicy story, but like I did want to always kind of be like, I learned a lesson in like, you can tell a story for so long without giving people something to like really nibble on, or like that really like propels them through the rest of the chapter. And so like, obviously this is a book of food writing, so it's like the thing that propels you is the food writing, and then the research is kind of like on either side of it, sort of.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
I can't articulate it well, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. I want to know, some of us when we write, so we, not to be like, oh, writers, but you know, some of us when we write, we have like an imagined reader in our head. Like, I wrote my first book for my mom, for example. Like, oh, how did my mom react to this? Who is your imagined reader? Who are you trying to reach with this book?
I did not have an imagined reader, honestly. Like, I was really just like, get it done. And I imagined the bad reader. I'm like George Costanza at therapy being like, I believe in God for the bad stuff. I believe in bad readers. I'm like, these people are gonna hate me for this, and these people are gonna hate me for this, so like, how do I deal with that? But at the end of the day, I obviously like wrote it the way I want to write it. But like, I think that it is about, you know, it was like, I wanted to write it for people who love food but don't, and you know, want to make these different kinds of choices but feel like that they're not able to. And so I wanted to like kind of just like be a nice like, yeah, bridge to dealing with these big questions around food without being like, I'm hitting you over the head and you're a bad person, you know. Like, because I started today reading Meat Love, which is like a new like Marxist text about meat and ideology. And I'm like, I love this. Like, tell me I'm a terrible person. But like, I know most people don't respond well to that, so I'm like, this is a very nice book about, you know, making an alternative decision that is increasingly a very important decision for a lot more people to make. And so like, what does that look like? What can that look like? Whose cultures and politics can it encompass? And yeah, I just wanted to make it like a nice journey for people and very inviting. And I do write for, I think my imagined audience isn't an omnivore, but I do think I write for an omnivorous audience that is curious about what it would be to be plant-based. Yeah.
You know, you talked about you know, your bad reader or whatever kind of being in your head. I think a lot of us can probably relate to that. And from my perspective, at least, you know, a lot of that comes from being on social media, you know. And I want to know, for you, what was it like to be on social media? You know, you were on Twitter when you were writing this book, and we're on Instagram, you know. How did that infect or aid, you know, the book writing process?
Being on Twitter infected my brain in a terrible way, 100%. Like, I'm so happy for the relationships Twitter gave me in my life, but was it a net negative for my brain functioning? Yes, absolutely. So I'm so glad that, like, I'm not glad that Elon has done what he did, but it's going to be
out. Yeah.
It was an easy out, absolutely. And I think everyone should get from a lot of it. But at the same time, it's difficult. I should be better at being on social media and balancing that. But it's really difficult for me, and I tell everyone this all the time. Like, I've been on social media like more than half my life. Like, I've been on LiveJournal, like I was on Diaryland. Like, once there was a way for me to write about myself on the internet and learn about like other people's little thoughts, I was like, I need this. Like, I was like, this is like reading a novel, but it's real. And then like, I've said this before, but it's like the people who aren't nerds came over for all of us. And like, I think that like the internet is for nerds, and everybody else should just like have a little section of it for themselves. But I am informed, of course, by like what people respond to on Instagram 100%. Like you know, and I do love having conversations with people for the most part, and I don't, you know, part of doing the newsletter too is that it's like my work doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's like in conversation with other people's work, in conversation with other people reading it. And I think the same thing about social media. It's something that can be used really well if you use it well and you have sort of limits on yourself and you have boundaries and that sort of thing. And like people will make you feel guilty about having boundaries about things, but they do not do that. And so I think it's a useful tool in terms of like understanding your audience, understanding what people are interested in, like knowing that I complained about this recently, but like everyone is putting desserts in stainless steel coupe, and like that's like important for me to know. And so like you know, it's just about like knowing what's going on. Yeah.
Keeping a pulse on the culture. Totally. So one of the virtues of your book, in my eyes, is that it is very optimistic. You know, you could have easily been so doom and gloom about the fact that our planet is dying, the way that so many of us eat, you know, is not exactly helping. But you know, you really seem hopeful that if we change our consumption habits as individuals, we can really help course correct in some way. So how did you arrive at that sort of optimism?
I think you just like have to be, and especially in a book like this, where it's like, okay, like omnivores are going to be reading this, people who eat differently than me are going to be reading this, and everyone is very overwhelmed by food all the time, especially like food costs are in wild right now. Like how do you live and make better decisions and have a job and raise kids or go to school or whatever it is? Like how do you balance all these things? And so I think that, you know, ending on a doomer note, even if I personally sometimes do feel that way, would be really a like besides the point. You know, like the point is it's supposed to empower everybody to feel like you have a role to play in solving a crisis that we are all facing, and that's a good thing ultimately. Ultimately, it's a good thing that we do all have a role to play and a potential for power in this situation, and what do we do with it, and how do we harness it, and you know, it's that prefigurative politics way of like, how do we live a life that gives us the systems that enable us to live even better? Like, you know, it's how do we do things that change things in a bigger way? And so yeah, it was just very like, you know, people have the power in the moment.
It's lovely, and it's not corny, you know, don't worry about that. You know, I wanted to know, so now the book has been out for a month. What has been the most surprising aspect of the reception to the book thus far?
Oh, you know, I expected, I mean, it's hard to say because I'm not looking at Goodreads reviews, so my uncle did read them for me. I am not looking at Amazon reviews. I am, you know, I'm like very like, oh, if someone tags me in something, I'm looking at it. If my publicist, lovely publicist Bev sends it to me, I'm looking at it. Like, I'm not going into the muck to try and find out why people hate me. I did, you know, like, because I am a vegetarian, eat oysters and other bivalves. Like, there are vegans who are mad at me. I'm sure some of them could be here. But at the same time, it's, you know, it's been a very positive response. I've been really shocked that people are like, I do want to eat a book called No Meat Required, and even if they're all, you know, eating chicken making at the same time. But I've been shocked that people are interested, honestly, and that's it. Like, it's very niche. I'm very niche, and I'm happy that people are into it. Yeah.
You know, I've noticed that a lot of the coverage of your book has fixated on like fake meat. Like a lot of the interviews with you guys. Why do you think that people have this kind of hang up?
Because they're obsessed with meat. They're obsessed with meat, so they're obsessed with fake meat. So it's like, this is the thing. It's like, and like that's why it's like, I don't know, like the meat chapter was so like, it was so easy to write to the point where my editor was like, cut this down. Because it's like, it's really easy to write about meat. It's so easy to talk about it. It's so easy to write about it. There's like it's just it's everywhere. It is like in everything. It's how everyone builds a plate. It's how everyone builds a meal. It's how you build a holiday. It's like, so, and everyone is like, oh, well, the fake meat, that will just be one-to-one. We'll just take that and then that'll be fine. It's like, no, it won't actually. Like, I mean, we have like, right now, like zero evidence that lobbying is going to be any less detrimental emissions-wise than beef. Like, I literally no evidence of that. Unless we, like, you know, put all the money that we use going into lab meat and maybe lab dairy, and it's a whole thing. And so like, but people are obsessed with it because it's a really easy way of talking about meals. It's a really easy way of talking about food because that's how we've been trained to do it. And for me, it's really it's not a boring conversation because it is really fascinating to talk about human behavior, and it's really fascinating to talk about like what would it be like to build the giant bioreactors to make the lab meat to feed everybody with the 200 pounds of meat a year. And so like it is a fascinating conversation. At the same time, it's like do we need it? No. So the fact that it takes up so much air is what's frustrating about it. Yeah.
So kind of on the topic of the reception of the book, and there's something I've noticed in just coverage of you over the years of being your friend is that sometimes you've been labeled in the press as things other than, writer Alicia Kennedy, or essayist Alicia Kennedy, or author Alicia Kennedy, Sometimes people have said the activist Alicia Kennedy, or they said the academic Alicia Kennedy because you teach at Boston University. How do you feel about those labels, activist or academic?
I don't like them. I'm not an activist in any way. I'm a writer. I literally, maybe, I've been in a protest in my life. But I'm not like, in the basement organizing. So I don't really understand why that label has stuck to me other than for a long time it was a way of people being dismissive of my work in general because I do write about climate change, because I do write about running a meme. So people are like, oh, she's an activist. So it only means so much. And then, now they can call me an academic. And it's it was a really seamless switch too. It was just like, oh, she's taught a class. She's an academic. What? As a freelance writer, I'm just they were going to pay me to teach the class. I taught the class. And I didn't change anything about how I identify or the structure of my work. I loved teaching. I loved it so much. And I had no idea I would love it. But at the same time, it doesn't make me an academic. I have a bachelor's degree. I don't particularly, I do public scholarship or what has been called public scholarship. But I am not focused on academia in any way or form. I think it does, if anything, it will probably upset people who are academics, who do have that education, to see someone who who's been for the public, working for media, called an academic. That feels so terrible to me because I'm no, there are people who literally did the studies, so they should get that.
And no one wins in this
No,
scenario.
it's really bad for everybody.
It's terrible. So hopefully now people will be calling you an author. But I want to know about the book, what is one thing you wish you would know about the book writing process before you began?
That it would be really hard. As a writer who's focused on the digital arena or short term pieces, you write for the most part 3,000 to 5,000 words. Or usually, frankly, 1,200, 800 words. You're not writing long anything ever. And I thought, well, I've been doing all this short form writing for so long. This will just be longer versions of everything I've ever written. That's not the case. But it's a process that you can only really learn through doing it. I don't think anyone can really, when you explain it to someone who's never done it, this is why it's nice to have friends who've written books, because it's you explain it to someone who hasn't done it, and they're just you are such a baby. Just go sit down and write the book. But it makes you feel so it's just having to sustain an idea and also make it pretty and also make it interesting and also when you're trained in such short form work, it's really, really difficult to find the strength to do the long work.
Well,
Are we going to the audience one?
Not yet. I think we have time for 2 more. Okay, you got this book out of your system, so now you can do it. What do you want to do next in an ideal world?
I would like to write a book that's more something that combines my newfound, hitherto unforeseen interest in culinary tourism. Because I was tasked with teaching culinary tourism, and I was oh, that makes sense. I do love this. And memoir, and trying to tie that into ecology as well, something. I mean, do I sound pretentious and a jerk? Something that's it's Rebecca Solnit, it's Maggie Nelson, and something big and meatier, but also more, for me, like something where I have more room, where I'm not like explaining and justifying everything to the audience.
Alright, well, I hope that you earned the right to do that with this amazing first book. So I think we can go to questions now from the audience. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a friend class in basically Berkeley, California, Alice Shack. I lived there in the 2000s. So the real issue is not vegetarianism, it's water. Like this book is kind of fascinating. Printed it on a hardcover. Like we wasted a lot of water printing the book about vegetarianism on a hardcover. That's my
Thank you.
Anyone? Next question, please. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to move this space long enough to know. Okay, thank you so much.
Can you speak a little bit to culinary tourism and being a vegan or vegetarian abroad or in other people's spaces and how to kind of navigate that and what your experience has been in terms of being able to eat or not able to eat different food from different cultures?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely, I'm actually working on something about this right now, where I do struggle with, you know, what has been called the grandma rule, where it's like if you're in a place where you are not from and you are served something, you are supposed to just eat it. And what does it mean when you have made these restrictions for yourself? I do think that in terms of my own experiences, being vegan is something that's very difficult to translate to folks, and being vegetarian is something that's very easy to translate. And so I think that the tension really lies in, you know, having that leeway when you travel. And I think for me, it's very much like, you know, going into a space, I need to know what that context is, what that cuisine is, where am I going to run into trouble in terms of my own restrictions, where am I willing to give leeway, and what concessions am I willing to make, or where will I not have to make concessions. It's about being a good culinary tourist for anybody. It's about knowing what you're getting into and the cuisine that you're interested in, and figuring out how you can best navigate that.
All right, next question, please. I'm coming up. You guys know someone else like that
So let's take it back. You're writing a book. There's lots of long nights involved. There's lots of long everything involved, because when you're a writer, that's just the way it is. What is something snacky that you're going to? What is soothing you? What is like satiating? You're like, I'm so frustrated. I'm so pissed. I can't. I need to eat. What is it that?
I will say there are no long nights involved in my writing because I am a sleepy person. And I think that this is such a boring answer, but it's dates and peanut butter. Like, I just eat dates and peanut butter all the time. Dates in general, dates with coconut. This is really a hangover from being vegan, where it's just like dates. When I need energy, dates. When I'm hungry, dates.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading the book. But also I wanted to say thank you, because I've been having to write a lot of essays in my work, and your writing has also inspired to kind of like insert personal stories in it, and it's quite academic. And it's actually been going very well because of that, so thank you. One of the things that I hated the most about your book is that it weaves in, well, you say that maybe you can talk as much about animal rights, but it has like that perspective you can think about, so human rights, social justice perspective, and the environmental perspective. And I think that there was somewhere that was kind of like, you're not going to consider, like, for example, how the cashews are being produced, like, you're missing the point. Yeah. and then also some of the writers that you recommend on writing?
It's really difficult to talk about labor rights in the food system because it does touch everything. Like there literally is there's no safe space, you know, like you have to kind of pick what your lane is and what, you know, is the most important to you, what's something you consume the most, and make the decisions based on that. Like how can I access this in a way that is the least exploitative? How can I access this in a way that, you know, is in line with what world I want to live in? I think that for me, talking about meat processing, especially industrial animal agriculture, is kind of the easiest way into, and the most significant way into that conversation for a lot of folks, especially in the US, where I saw a study today that said 72% of Americans don't believe meat and dairy have any effect on climate change. And so, you know, we're really finding an uphill battle that is like, okay, like we're really starting from zero constantly. So what is the easiest way to make this argument about the environment, labor rights, animal welfare? For me, it starts with industrial animal agriculture and meat processing. And for me, it would be really remiss of me to talk about these issues and then write a whole chapter about like non-dairy dairy and not mention that like all these fantastic cashew cheeses, like they might be made with cashews that have been shelled by enslaved people whose hands are burned from the process. And so I don't want to, I'm laughing because it's such a complex question, because it really is just like, how do you eat and not be part of an exploitative system? It's very difficult, it's impossible. But for me, it's about thinking, how do I make the best steps towards that? How do I make decisions every day that push that world into existence in the best way possible? And the writers I was talking about earlier, like Lauren Elkin is my favorite writer right now, I think. And she has a new book coming out called Art Monsters that I'm very excited about. Lauren Elkin, and her book is called Art Monsters, the new one.
All right, over here, if you don't mind just passing the mic over.
Hi. You mentioned Augusta as being a person who was formative in your journey. She was also formative in mine. And so I'm curious how you navigate now being that person to people who come across your work.
I don't navigate because I know not to know. You know, I'm always happy to talk about the work and talk about things, but I don't, if I thought about that, that would be difficult. So I don't think about that. And also, no one tells me that, so thank God, like, don't do that.
And I think I saw Hannah the row 2 on the side. Sorry.
So I know you said you weren't thinking about your reader, but I think you write a lot about the difference between the decisions we can make as individuals and the systems that are sort of beyond our control. And as you were writing this, how did you like grapple with those two things in a way that still like found a way to make your reader feel empowered while not feeling like overwhelmed by these systems?
I mean, I think it just comes back to the beauty of food writing is that you're dealing with something that people are dealing with every single day, you know? And so it's about how do we bring all of these big systems into the decisions you're making when you're at the grocery store, when you're in the kitchen, when you're at a restaurant, you know? I wrote a piece a while ago, and I think about it a lot, about, you know, statistically shrimp is right behind beef in terms of greenhouse gas emissions because of mangrove destruction, and, you know, there's been a lot of things written about, you know, slave conditions on shrimping boats in Southeast Asia. And, you know, I think about that piece because I think about, like, for a lot of people, they think that shrimp is, like, a better decision than eating beef all the time. Like, it's always going to be better to eat shrimp than it is to eat beef. But, you know, if you're the kind of the how do you make it workable? And I think, it's about saying like, this is what someone who cooks for a living has done. Like in that piece, I talked to a recipe developer who decided never to write recipes with shrimp anymore because they couldn't ensure that their readers would get shrimp from, a local fish monger who's sourcing responsibly. And so, but they don't have to tell their readers they're making this decision too. And so like a lot of the time, I think it's about making these kinds of choices less explicit. Obviously the book is called No Meat Required, and it's about plant-based eating, so it's very explicit about what it's about. But I think in like day-to-day writing or day-to-day food writing or food discussions, it's okay to not make these choices like the biggest thing, and to just say, this is what I'm doing that makes sense, that works because of this, and not be like, if you're eating shrimp, you're a bad person. It's sort of just like, we're part of this big system, but here's how we navigate it day to day. And if you don't navigate it tomorrow in the best way, and then the next day you're like, I don't know, some sort of food sourcing superstar, then like, that's cool. And I think that's the way of making it sort of work. But yeah, it's not an easy space to navigate, because some people will be, speaking of like imagined readers, like some people are going to take it all very like personally, no matter what you do, and some people are not going to care at all. And so it's just like, wherever it hits, kind of. You have to believe.
So I have a question.
Hi.
So you mentioned Puerto Rico, you referenced Puerto Rico quite a lot. And you mentioned that Puerto Rico imports 85% of goods, and we can go on as to why that is for a whole hour. But I guess I just wanted to ask, how has living in Puerto Rico impacted or even inspired your writing and your research?
It has been huge in terms of the understanding food access on a day-to-day basis. And, I moved to San Juan from Brooklyn, where I had everything all the time. And, any spice or any it's like, oh, I need agar powder, like, I gotta go get it. I need Mayukh butter, I gotta go to the fancy bodega. Everything was a very easy thing to access. And in San Juan, it's not that easy. I don't know. There was a recent thing where it's like, I went to the grocery store and there was no soy tofu, but there was chickpea tofu, which was such a weird, I'm just like, how did this happen? But it's something where it's like, okay, now I'm gonna learn about this. So it's like, there are things where it's like, some things are restrictions on what you can cook, and some things are things that just open everything up, where it's like, someone will give us a bag of lemons, or someone will be giving out mangoes, which I shouldn't process because I'm actually allergic to them. And then, there's just so much star fruit, or there's so much breadfruit, and it's like, okay, I have to deal with this. And so it's really taught me, what it means to eat seasonally in a way that is so, where you really you'll get sick of something. When Hurricane Fiona came last year, we ate so many avocados afterwards because the avocados were falling from the trees in anticipation of the storm, and then it was a big community effort, we're gonna eat all these avocados. And I still don't want to eat any avocados, it was so many, but at the same time, it gave me this lesson in what it means to okay, this is what's growing, this is what's doing well, this is what I'm going to eat, because I want to eat what's from here. I don't want to eat what's imported for the most part, in terms of produce. And so I'm going to just go with it. I'm going to go with the effort to eat these avocados, even if I'm sick of them. I'm going to find a million ways to eat carabola. I'm going to, and then there's the other side of it too, where it's there are, because of the microclimates and the micro seasons, there are things where it's acerola comes in and it's I gotta use it so good, and I gotta enjoy it so well. And so it's this lesson about what seasonality really means. That has been so important to me. I don't think I could have learned that anywhere else, because it's Puerto Rico, the archipelago, is such a unique place, as you know.
We have time for 1 to 2 more questions. I see a hand here, and then we'll take the middle of the meeting.
so much for being here. It's a very blue sky question, but if you had to envision kind of utopian food systems, what would that look like for you? Kind of building up the seasonality.
Yeah. I think talking about regionalities was really important to me now. I think a really good person to think about with this work, and if you read my newsletter, I'm being redundant now, but Aubrey Barron is from Michigan, who's a chef, a farmer, and a cookbook author who is really, really focused on here's what grows in the Midwest, and here's how to use it best, and this is, there are going to be things that we need on a global scale that we need to, produce on a really huge scale, but for the most part, I think if we think about food systems as regional places of production, processing, consumption, and not a global system that needs to feed 10 billion people. How do we do it? Let's think of the question in terms of regions and smaller ecosystems, and how do we do that? And I think that we're coming to a place where that's becoming a very apparent, response. But of course, there is getting away from the monolithic notion of what food is and what food looks like is a net positive, I think. And so if you're eating seasonally for your region, that's getting in the direction of supporting something that is actually going to feed people in a real way. If that makes sense.
Hi. Hey. So you mentioned, in the book you mentioned superiority burger a fair few times. You mentioned Mayukh in Brooklyn, and Kitchen Mama you mentioned too, being one of VA's top restaurants. And typically, each of those restaurants, when the name is invoked, it's also repetitive with being vegetarian, right? So they're already being pigeonholed. In that, with EMP, everybody kind of, now with their eyes on this plant-based plant-based sort of becoming more proliferating through the culinary scene. How much power or sort of ability do you see restaurants specifically having to sort of call people to change?
I think that, it's a slow-going type of change, but I think it's an absolutely positive change. I mean, especially places like Superiority Burger, Pietramala, these are places that are wildly focused on their regional food sheds, and these are places that are calling out the farmers that they're working with. And I don't want to say that, because farm to table is so boring in terms of omnivores, it became a very cliche thing to talk about. But when you're talking about vegetarian food, it kind of takes on a whole new meaning, I think. And it's not. I don't think it's something I can articulate well. I think it's a real feeling of this is doing something different. This is a different way of interacting with the local food system. And when I went to Superiority Burger and it was, in the old Odessa space and it was packed and people were waiting for tables and there's no meat there, call me corny, but that's really, really big to me. And so I think that these are absolutely really, really positive. I think that the way the narratives around these spaces can come up when they kind of interact with mainstream media, they get simplified, and it becomes sort of just oh look, there's actually a good vegan restaurant, actually a good vegetarian restaurant. They can't say anything else about it because, and this is also kind of why I want to write the book. It's here's this history, figure out the context for these places, figure out the context for this food. And I think, it can be very easy to just interact with these spaces as a novelty, but I think what they're doing ultimately is so much more powerful than what 11 Madison Park could do, because Superiority Burger, even though it's more expensive than it used to be, and there's a wait for a table, it is still it's a more accessible space. Pietramala is fine dining, but it's not a place that anyone is going to feel too fancy and too overwhelming. And so it's still being available, it's still being hospitable in this kind of old school vegetarian way, but interacting with food in a new way. And so I don't know, I have a lot of unformed thoughts on both of these restaurants. that I'm trying to get at, but like, I just think it's such a net positive, and like, I don't care if it's corny and basic of me to be like, these restaurants are really, they can really change people's minds.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for coming. As I mentioned earlier tonight, we will be having a signing line where we will be personalizing your copies of the book. It's going to be at the desk where you checked in, and if you haven't bought a copy, we have plenty up front, and we also have a book as well. Let's give one more round of applause. Thank you.